Right, hello and welcome to the tutorial on how to do question 3A for the Germany paper. So this is the source analysis question. For this question, you want to be doing 2 times cope paragraphs. I'll talk through that structure in a second. Key kind of tips from me for this question is you do not need to compare the sources. So please don't compare and feel like you need to try and make comparisons. You won't get any marks for that. Use specific own knowledge in your analysis of the 2 sources that you were given, and don't use, when considering provenance, don't use the phrase first-hand experience or say that a source is biased, okay? Because those are well, biased, there's a whole kind of debate as to why that should not be used. And first-hand experience is too vague. It's not specific enough. So if you want to say first-hand experience and then to develop and expand upon that, that's fine. But you can't just use first-hand experience and just leave it at that. The most important thing as well, which I've not even put down, is always say the source is useful, okay? But remember, you need to say how useful, okay? So use words and phrases like partly useful, very useful, or completely useful, those kind of phrases, okay? So in terms of what the question will look like then, so in fact, let me talk through what COPE stands for. So COPE stands for content, own knowledge, provenance, and evaluate. And I'll expand on what each one of those kind of entails when we actually look at a practice question. So you'll be given a question and it will be study sources B and C. Let me just get my annotation tool up. So in this case, how useful are sources B and C for an inquiry into, and what you want to do is when you get the question, the words after into, you just want to highlight like I'm doing here, okay? And what that does is it tells you not only the period, so we're looking at 1933 to 39, so when the Nazis are in power, and then crucially, the theme of these sources. So we're considering the extent of support. That is the theme for this question. Now, sometimes the themes will be really specific. So, for example, there have been past questions on Weimar culture, or the treatment of women in Nazi Germany, or the Hitler Youth. Those are really specific topics. Now, the benefit of that is it's clear what the source is, what you need to be looking for. This one, on the other hand, the extent of support through quite a lot of candidates because it's quite vague. Okay, so at no point in the textbook is there just one section which says support for the Nazis. Instead, there's loads of different relevant topics. So, for example, we might think about the youth in society and whether they supported the Nazis or not. We might think about workers in society, whether they support the Nazis or not. We might think about rallies and so on, okay? So, for example, the Nuremberg rallies, okay? So in terms of what you want to do, before we even look at the sources, if I just remind you of the key parts, so I'll just annotate the timeline that we've got here. So when I'm thinking of support, I'm going to be thinking about the following topics. So I'd probably be thinking about how Hitler's control of the economy was weak in some ways. Let me just zoom in a little bit. There we go. So I might also be talking about the Hitler and the youth. Okay, so we could talk about the Hitler Youth, talk about schooling as well, if I wanted to. I could also think about opposition groups. So that's an example of Hitler not being supported. We could also even consider Hitler and the church as well. So the fact that he tries to get the support of the Catholics and Protestants in Nazi Germany. And the other thing I'd be talking about is where is it on here? The bit about the Nuremberg rallies. So that is, yes, here. So the part on propaganda and censorship. Okay. So this stuff here. All right. So the fact that in Nuremberg, there were rallies which saw crowds sometimes of over 200,000. The Nazis would control newspapers and radios, control what people would think, and so on and so forth. Okay. Right. So now that you've got the knowledge fresh in your mind, let's have a look at the sources that we're going to have a look at today. Okay. So let me get rid of all this. Right. Okay, so here's our question again. So how useful sources B and C for an inquiry to the extent of support? And now what I would do is if I were you, I would pause the video, have a read through the sources, and complete the analysis for both sources yourself. And let's see if you come to similar conclusions that I arrive at. Okay, so pause the video and have a go at this yourself. Okay, so hopefully you pause the video, and now let's just talk through sources B and C. So source B is from a secret account written by an opponent of the Nazi regime in December 1936. Here he is commenting on the workers in a car factory in Munich, okay? And basically, the first thing I would be doing is when I open the exam, I would really simply next to the source, basically just in a couple of words, just say what's the theme of the source and how does it link to our topic, okay? So what is the source basically saying about the amount of support the Nazis have? So this source is essentially saying that the Nazis had less support than they thought, okay? And that workers pretended to agree with them and that they actually didn't. Whereas source C at the bottom suggests that the Nazis enjoyed considerable support, okay? So that's basically what the sources would suggest, okay? Right, so now that you've written that next to the sources, now let's do our analysis, so our COPE analysis. Let me just delete these. Okay. Okay, so let's start with source B then. So source B. First things first is we want to be talking about the content. So we're going to talk about the fact that it suggests that the Nazis, that workers did not support the Nazis and only pretended to do so. Okay. And then we must, if it is a written source, we must give a quote. Okay. So a quote that would support this. We might talk about something like there are only a few Nazis working in the factory, and even they think the broadcasting of these speeches there's more harm than good. Okay, bit of a lengthy quotation. When you're identifying quotations, you could do top turn tail. So you could think about the top of the source. So towards the start, they'll always put the most important quotes either at the top or in the middle or at the end. So if you're going for the one at the top, you might talk about the workers in this factory will never be won over by Nazi policies. That's probably the best quote to use. Then in the turn to the middle part of the source, you could talk about the fact that the members of the SA forced them to be quiet, would be the quote there. And then they'll always put an important quote in the end as well. And that's the one that I've gone for. Okay, so if in doubt, look at the top of the source, look at the middle of the source, look at the bottom. We then need to link that with our own knowledge. So an example of people being angry with the Nazis and not actually following what they are saying. There's loads of things we could talk about. So I'm going to just focus on workers because that's kind of what the source is on about. But you could talk about Hitler Youth if you wanted to. You talk about the fact that there was groups like the Edelweiss Pirates and the Swing Youth who challenged and there were clear demonstrations of the fact that the Nazis didn't have full support. Okay, so that's an option. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to focus on the weaknesses of the Nazi regime when it comes to workers. So in particular, I'll show you what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about this part here. So I'm going to talk about the fact that the Nazis do employ many policies which annoy the people, and especially the workers. So we could talk about the labor front. We could talk about the fall in real wages. We could talk about the average working week. Okay, so I'm just going to jot a couple of those down just here. Okay. So let's talk about the fact that average working hours went up by 6, fall in real wages, and then we could also mention the DAF. I'm not going to mention all three. I'm just going to mention one or two of those. Okay, no more than that, because otherwise you don't have the time. For provenance, you want to first of all think about why it's going to be useful. So the fact that this is a secret account published during the years means that this is a it's not a form of propaganda. Okay, so not a form of Nazi propaganda. All right. So that's the key thing. That's what it's not. Okay, and instead, the fact that it's an account means that he's trying to convey his own views. Okay, so to convey his kind of suffering and struggle. You could potentially always consider why a source is not 100% useful. So never say a source is not useful. You might say the source is slightly limited. Now here, there isn't really an obvious limitation, okay? You could talk about the fact that we don't know the identity of the writer. So we don't know that much about who has written it, apart from the fact that they're an opponent of the Nazi regime, okay? And because they're an opponent, they're going to necessarily take that kind of opinion, okay? So you could potentially show, and I'll do this in a different color, the fact that they are an opponent means that they are necessarily going to take a negative view, okay? It's negative, never going to be positive. It's also not necessarily representative of society. Now, because this is a generally useful source, so it tells us, it gives us an insight into what workers actually thought. It matches up with some of our own knowledge about how workers were abused. And the fact that it is a secret account, so it's not a form of propaganda, we would say that this is either very useful or at least quite useful. I'm going to go with quite useful, okay? So always for provenance, always focus on why it's useful. And if you can, think about why it might not be fully useful, okay? If you can't do that part, that means the source is very useful. So you just write it's very useful. Okay, the next one is a photograph. So we can talk about, because it's photography, we have to pick out what we can see. So from what we can see obviously lots of people waving or doing the Hitler salute, sorry, to Hitler as he is being greeted in a railway station, okay? And it's in 1936, which is a time of kind of high support for the Nazis, okay? So we can see then that Hitler enjoyed considerable support from the people of Germany, and we can see, I mean, our evidence for that is I can see crowds of people around the train, okay? Now, our own knowledge for that is we can talk about the Nuremberg rallies where 200,000 people would attend, okay? So massive attendance, and they were very, very famous, okay? In particular, one of the largest rallies was actually in 1936, okay? So we could talk about the fact that there was at the time key rallies in 1936, including the Nuremberg rally, okay? Let me just make sure I've got that right. Yeah, fine, okay. So for provenance, we want to talk about that this is a photograph, okay? So on the one hand, it's allowing us to gain insight into the amount of support for Hitler and for and for us to be able to visualize. So if it's a photo, always say the word like visualize the amount of support. The negative of this is the fact that it is a photograph, and photographs, and you can always say this for photographs can be choreographed or staged, okay? So in this case, it might be choreographed or staged, or alternatively, it could be used as a form of propaganda, all right? So we can see that there is a crowd here, but of course there's going to be a crowd. It's literally Hitler arriving at a station. His enemies aren't going to arrive to cheer him. It's only going to be the people that really like him, okay? So of course it's going to be like that. So the evaluation part, we would say partly useful. So it's not fully, it's not useful. Don't say, oh, because it was a photograph of Hitler and it's form of propaganda, therefore it's not useful. All sources are useful, okay? It's just that it's not potentially as useful as other sources might be, all right? So what we're going to now do is we're going to write up our answers. So we'll start with source B. So remember, there's no need to compare. So each source is going to have its own paragraph, and they're going to be separate and can self-contain paragraphs. So we'll start by saying source B is quite useful for a historian conducting an inquiry into the extent of support for the Nazis. The source suggests that Hitler and the Nazis did not command a complete majority, did not command the respect of all, and that workers actually only pretended to like Hitler. Very few actually did, okay? And then we give our quote. So I might go for the different quote just because it's a little bit better than the one at the top. So I might say, it says, the workers in the factory, what does it actually say? The workers in this factory will never be won over by Nazi policies. She will never be won over by Nazi policies. Okay, so that's my quote. Notice how I'm not just giving a quote and leaving it. I'm saying what it suggests as a source, and then I give my quote. Okay, so I can then say, I'm then going to try and link that to my own knowledge. Okay, so I'm going to say this content or this quote is useful because it matches my own knowledge. In particular, I know that that workers in key cities under the Nazis suffered because of Nazi rule. For example, the average working week went up by 6 hours, and there was a fall in real wages by, what was the actual figure? Fall in real wages by 20%, due to increasing food prices. Okay. This therefore would have meant workers suffered and would have been opposed to the Nazis, which is evident in source B. Okay, so I'm not only just saying it links, I'm explaining the link. Okay, if you want the top marks, you've got to do that level of detail, explain how it's linked. We can then say the provenance of the source makes it further useful because it was a secret account published during the high point of the Nazi regime, meaning it is not a form of Nazi propaganda and is the authentic, or is the real viewpoint, you might say, of someone living at the time. However, it was written by an opponent, so it is unsurprising that they take a negative view. Okay, and then you say, therefore, this source is quite useful based on its content, based on its historical accuracy. So we talk about the fact that it links to our own knowledge, that means it's historically accurate, and its provenance, which is helpful, but which is generally helpful despite some limitations. Okay, something like that. So let me just break it down. So first things first is I'm giving my judgment in that first part. I then do my content. So I'll highlight content in red. We then go on to my own knowledge and explaining how my own knowledge supports what's in the source. We then have provenance in purple, and then we have in blue my overall evaluation. Okay, so that's basically the source B. And now let's do source C. So we say source C is partly useful for a historian. Okay, for a historian gauging the extent of Nazi support. So notice how I'm always using the wording of the question. Okay. Okay, so then I would say in the source, it is clear that Hitler enjoys a lot of support from the people who are crowding around the train and giving the Heil Hitler salute. Okay, so that's my content done. All right. So I'm then going to say this partly matches, or this matches my own knowledge as so I can talk about this matches my own knowledge as I know that in 1936, when the source was created, the Nazi support for the Nazis was clearly on display when over 200,000 people attended the Nuremberg rally of 1936. Look at how specific my evidence is, guys. 200,000 people. I'm giving specific numbers, okay? But this proves that this proves source C's, this proves the idea in source C that the Nazis enjoyed a lot of support. Okay, now we're going to move on to provenance. The provenance makes the source more helpful or more useful as it is a photograph, allowing us to directly visualize the level of support. However, photographs can be choreographed or staged to make Hitler appear more popular, and this photograph was likely, it didn't say, but we can probably guess that it was likely used as a piece of propaganda, meaning it does not capture the real level of support for the Nazis. Okay? Therefore, the source is partly useful based on its content and based on its content and my knowledge of the period. However, there are some limitations with its provenance. Okay. So again, let me just show you. So here I'm basically giving the content. So that's in red. Then I do my own knowledge, which is in green. Again, I'm explaining my own knowledge. I then am doing my provenance, showing both sides. Remember, I don't have to show both sides. I'm just chosen to. I'm trying to press the examiner, and then I'm giving my overall opinion at the end. Okay, so that's basically how you do 3A, 2-quote paragraphs. Always say the source is useful, but say how far. If you don't say how useful it is, if you don't use words like partly or quite or very or completely, then you are capping the number of marks you can get. Use specific own knowledge, and then don't use the phrase first-hand experience or biased, because they are not sophisticated phrases for GCSE level. Okay, hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all in the next video.